Hello everyone, and welcome to this video on trauma, codependency, attachment, and abandonment. This one really hits home for me. My name is Erica, for those of you who don't know me, and for the purpose of this video, I am a second-year psychology student, and mental health healing is my passion. So we'll discuss how codependency might actually make sense from a trauma-informed perspective, and we'll discuss trauma-informed strategies to address these abandonment and attachment issues. So let's start with secure attachments. These help us feel safe and loved and provide support and assistance. When we're kids, being securely attached to our caregivers gives us a safe place to go back to when we experience failures or rejections or anxiety or any of those things. Secure attachments are essential for helping children learn and develop emotions and how to manage them, as well as essential in helping them feel safe and lovable. And in adulthood, we still need these secure attachments. It's not just like as soon as you turn 18 and you just don't need people anymore. We do, just these attachments change. In childhood, secure attachments tend to be more focused on those primary caregivers. In adulthood, we have a lot of people in our lives, and each one of them may fill a slightly different aspect of what we need in our life, but those secure attachments are numerous. Children who don't consistently have a consistent, responsive, attentive, validating, encouraging, and supportive caregiver might develop insecure attachment. And if you hadn't noticed, consistent, responsive, attentive, validating, encouraging, and supportive, there's a mnemonic there, and it's craves, so help you remember. Early attachment creates a prototype for future relationships, and later experiences of rejection and abandonment can also inhibit secure adult attachment. So just because you might have a great childhood doesn't mean that something hasn't happened along the way, even into your adulthood, that hasn't altered your attachment styles. You know, there can be some very pivotal, toxic relationships in our adulthood, in our lives, that could really cause us to feel unsafe and wonder whether we can trust other people at all. Insecure attachments lead to a pervasive sense of unsafeness and sometimes disempowerment, which can cause disruption of your HPA-Axis or your threat response system and will lead to a whole variety of symptoms. Now, normally when our threat response system is kicked in, we have this fight or flight. Those are the two go-tos. But there are frantic, and we see that more in people who have insecure attachment. They do everything to frantically avoid that trauma. They don't feel safe, and they don't feel like they've got anyone else that they can rely on, so they become very, very frantic. And some people freeze. They feel like a deer in the headlights. They don't know what to do. They don't know where to go. They don't feel like there's a safe option for them. And then finally, there's the forget about it, fuck it group. And those are the people who've just been so stressed for too long, and they just can't. They just don't have it in them. They just can't. I can't deal with this. When people have insecure attachments, it's traumatic. Trauma, in and of itself, creates a sense of unsafeness and disempowerment. And that's one of the foundational things that we need to address from a trauma-informed perspective. The first thing we need to do is help people start developing a sense of safety and personal empowerment. Insecure attachment can look different between different people, of course, which is true for everything. But there's typically 3 different types of insecure attachment styles. There's avoidant insecure attachment, which can share a lot of characteristics with antisocial personality, avoidant personality disorder, PTSD, and acute stress disorder. It's really important to note, though, that just because you might have this avoidant attachment doesn't necessarily mean you have any of these other diagnoses, which are just a diagnosis. It's not who you are. It's just to recognize that people with these different diagnoses may have significant trauma and attachment disruptions in their past that is prompting, that is causing some of their symptoms. People who have avoidant attachment styles learn early on that people can't be trusted, and they become really distant or withdrawn. They just figure, why should I try to count on someone who's just not going to be there anyway? It'll lead me to more disappointment or worse, hurt, and etc. So no. And they often lack empathy. It's hard to empathize with others when you don't feel like they empathize with you. And a lot of times, people who have avoidant attachment styles never received empathy or learned how to experience empathy as children. They often fear commitment. Well, if their primary attachments in their lives have consistently let them down, it would make sense that they might be a little afraid to get into another situation where they're vulnerable. And so they'll avoid conflict by either shutting down, leaving, or even ending the relationship. And these are self-protective strategies. They say, I don't want to be hurt. I'm just going to take the power in this relationship, and instead of getting into a conflict where I might lose, I'm going to just get out. I'm not going to engage in that. So I still retain my power. And that is a survival strategy. The person with an anxious attachment style, however, some of these characteristics can be seen in codependency, in borderline, in histrionic personality disorder, and also, again, PTSD. And for these people, their caregivers were often inconsistent, so they latch on to others. They're needy, persistent, have difficulty separating themselves from their partner in healthy ways. They often interpret conflict or arguments as a signal that their partner is going to leave them. And then they begin frantically doing things to try to avoid abandonment. So the anxious person, when they start to fear abandonment, when they start to fear that they're not secure in their relationship, their anxiety, their HPA-Axis, their fight or flight, that kicks in, and they do whatever they feel that they need to in order to try to maintain that relationship. In the anxious attachment, this is the person who had a little taste maybe of what love and compassion and all those other things felt like. And so sometimes they would get it and sometimes they wouldn't. And so they just so desperately want those good times back that they just frantically try to create those situations. And disorganized attachment contains characteristic of both anxious and avoidant attachment styles. It's actually pretty common to have a mix of both. So why do people develop insecure attachment? Well, let's assume that we're talking about primary attachments. Well, either way, whether it's primary or later in life, the person will often has difficulty with trusting that their person, that the other person in their relationship is going to be there. And so this could be due to, a death. A parent could have died, a loved one could suddenly die, or a relationship loss, especially if it's sudden. And if we're talking about children, it could be especially traumatic to them if their primary caregiver suddenly disappears. Abused or victimization can also cause attachment disruption, because when the people you care about and you think care about you abuse or victimize you, then it can contribute to this sense of unsafeness and questioning your own judgment and neglect and basic needs not being met. When a child doesn't get their basic needs met, the world feels very unsafe. And so it's important to recognize that child neglect, emotional neglect, physical neglect, medical neglect, all of those things can contribute to disrupted attachment later in life, because children look to their primary caregivers for safety, security, consistency, responsiveness. Now, why does it happen? Well, maybe the caregivers or the significant other might have mental health issues or substance abuse issues that can keep them from being able to securely attach. They might have attachment issues themselves, or they might be so depressed that they just can't possibly emotionally connect with someone else. Or they might have substance abuse issues that are preventing them from being able to be consistent, responsive, attentive, validating, encouraging, and supportive. Another reason that children might experience trauma is because of unidentified needs in the child. And this is not the parent trying to be neglectful. Sometimes children who are highly sensitive, sometimes children who have undiagnosed disorders, ADHD, autism spectrum, etc. There can be a lot of things that might go undiagnosed in children. So if they are having difficulties with sensory overstimulation, for example, that might not get picked up on right away. And depending on the caregivers, maybe not at all. But it's not that the caregiver is not trying to intentionally, be neglectful, but from the child's perspective, from the infant's perspective, the world is dangerous and painful and overwhelming. And that can lead to attachment disruption with the child and the caregiver, again, through no fault of the caregiver or the child, because the child's needs were not identified. And so this is one of the reasons that regular, pediatric appointments and communication with other caregivers, co-parents, is very important. Keeping journals or logs, for example, of triggers for babies who are really fussy or irritable. It can give you a really good cue or indicator, clues as to what might be going on with your child. So let's talk about the symptoms of codependency. Because symptoms of codependency often emerge in people with insecure attachment. So they might have a pattern of intense and unstable relationships. Well, if their prior relationships, especially their primary caregivers from childhood, if those relationships were unstable, then it makes sense that that's their love map, so to speak. It's all they know. It's what they're going to recreate. They don't know how to create a healthy relationship that's more stable. Fear of emotional intimacy, as characterized by either shallow relationships, so having multiple shallow relationships, or picking unavailable partners. And when you've been hurt before, when you've been in situations, especially, again, those primary attachment, in which the caregivers or the significant other were not responsive, then the desire to make oneself emotionally vulnerable and available goes down significantly. Why would I want to put myself out there just to get my feelings stomped on? Needing constant reassurance. If the person grew up in an environment, especially in the anxious attachment, if they grew up in an environment where sometimes the caregiver was happy with them and attentive, and then other times through no fault of their own, the caregiver was either unhappy with them or angry at them, at the world, or just checked out, then the child might have developed a sense that they can't figure out when it's going to be safe. They can't figure out if it's safe, if that person's going to come back. So they might need this constant reassurance that they're okay and that this person's not going to abandon them. Hypervigilance. When you grow up in a chaotic environment, whatever that might have looked like, whether it's neglectful or random, you start, especially as children, but even in adult relationships, you become hypervigilant to nonverbal cues, to behaviors, to tones, to a voice, in order to try to predict when bad things are going to happen. So you become more hypervigilant to potential signs of abandonment. And that can be really detrimental, because a lot of times we can overgeneralize things and we can assume that something means one thing when it actually was a completely benign scenario. So it's important to recognize that this hypervigilance that someone with codependency has serves them, because it helps keep them from being caught unaware, for example, or helps keep them from being emotionally injured or abandoned. And again, hypersensitive to criticism. How does that make any sense? Well, if you grow up in an environment where you don't receive positive attention, or you don't receive support and encouragement, healthy support, and when you don't receive consistent love from your caregivers, then any sign of criticism might indicate impending rejection and abandonment. So people who are codependent often are hypersensitive to criticism, because this helps them, again, prepare, prevent, and maintain their own power in a certain sort of way in the relationship. They're not going to be caught by surprise. Overanalysis paralysis. Don't know where I stole that from, but I like it. People with codependency can overanalyze every little thing, so that they actually don't end up making any moves. They keep thinking about what if, and they never actually choose an option, choose a response, and move forward. And overanalyzing things goes along with hypervigilance and all of these other things, that as a way to try to help keep this person safe. Intrusive thoughts of abandonment or rejection. Well, that's pretty self-explanatory. If you have been abandoned or rejected before, especially from primary caregivers or, main attachments, if you've been put in a situation, when primary caregivers reject a child, it's not just, oops, this happened. It could be life-threatening. A 2-year-old, a 4-year-old can't fend for themselves. So rejection from a primary caregiver carries with it not only physical consequences, but also very heavy emotional and cognitive consequences. So people who've experienced rejection might have these thoughts of abandonment regularly triggered. And so they can be triggered when things are going well. It's like, oh, things are going too well. Okay, I'm going to start bracing because that shoe's about to drop any second now. Or those thoughts might happen when they start sensing discontent in their partner or, their significant other. And then there's relationship sabotage. Makes sense, again, if someone gets into a situation where they start feeling great, it can be really terrifying, because the better you feel, the further the fall when things go bad. So sometimes people will totally sabotage their own relationship in an effort to prevent themselves from being too hurt or being too vulnerable or getting hurt too much. It's just a way of ending this relationship without actually coming out and ending anything. If they sabotage the relationship, they can also sometimes blame the other person. But we'll get into that in another video. They might cling to unhealthy relationships. People who have insecure attachment often are desperate for a safe haven. And some people, avoid. But other people will try to find a relationship, any relationship, because they're so terrified of being alone. People pleasing. Well, people pleasing prevents rejection, so it makes sense. Difficulty trusting others. If your primary caregivers weren't trustworthy or demonstrated that there was, mistrust going on, say, in the marriage, it's going to be hard to trust other people. Someone that you trusted greatly, a spouse, significant other, betrayed you. It might be really difficult to trust other people. Now, not every relationship that has betrayal in it, or not every relationship that ends, is going to lead to someone becoming codependent, of course, but it's important to recognize that the intensity of the pain, the intensity of the trauma of the ending of that relationship can alter people's sense of security in future relationships unless we address that. Self-blame when things don't work out. A lot of times when people have been in insecure relationships in the past, they've been told it's their fault. So they've internalized those messages, whether they believed them or not. And now they have this inner critic that as soon as something's not going right, that inner critic comes out and is like, I told you so. And starts telling them all of the reasons why it was their fault. Maybe they heard it from prior relationships or from parents. Maybe their prior relationships might have blamed them for why things didn't work out. And sometimes, maybe they were sabotaging the relationship. Maybe it's important to examine this, though, and we will talk about how to deal with this stuff in just a few moments. But low self-esteem or a sense of unworthiness. Well, if your primary caregivers, were not willing to give you consistent, responsive, attentive, encouraging, supportive feedback and love, then, you got to start wondering. And children think dichotomously. They can't step back and think, well, mom had a bad day, or caregiver had a really bad day, or they're just depressed right now, so it's them, not me. Little kids don't think that way. They can't. We don't develop that abstract thinking capability until a little later in life, late middle school, high school, depending on you. So when relationships go badly in childhood, it's really traumatic, and a lot of times the child blames themselves and feels a sense of unworthiness that they carry with them. Like, the person who gave me life doesn't even love me, so who else is going to? Emotional dysregulation or emotional numbing. When you've been in traumatic relationships, then you might be more likely to be stressed a lot of the time, to be hypervigilant all of the time, to have this underlying current of anger or pessimism or anxiety most of the time, fear, distrust. And when that happens, your HPA-Axis, your threat response system, dysregulates. And basically, when things are going good and are okay, the person might feel kind of flat, if not still anxious. But then when things start going bad, they might dysregulate. Their body actually has a much more significant response because the body's been trained by the mind. So to this adversity, than a person whose HPA-Axis is calibrated effectively. So other people will just numb out. Some will dissociate in order to just prevent feeling the pain. Anxiety, well, we kind of talked about why people might experience anxiety. Depression. Depression occurs, in general, when people feel hopeless, helpless, or disempowered. Jealousy or envy is another common characteristic in codependency. You can be jealous of other people who have healthy relationships, for example. We all want healthy relationships. So it makes sense that if you see someone that has something, this storybook relationship, and every relationship that you've ever had was dumpster fire, it makes sense that you could feel these feelings of jealousy or envy. So send love to yourself about that. And then being highly critical of self and others. A lot of times, people who've been in insecure relationships don't exactly know why the relationships ended, or why that person couldn't be what they wanted them to be, why that person couldn't be the caregiver that they were needed, or that the significant other that they needed. So they start trying to find reasons, and this is where that high criticism starts to come in. And also being highly critical might serve another function, because if I'm being highly critical of others, then in a way I'm kind of trying to tear them down. So maybe they won't need me. If I'm critical of you, then, you might not think that you're too good for me, and maybe then you won't abandon me. So what do we do about it? Well, there's lots of treatment options. Explore your prior relationships, patterns, projections, and the lessons learned, the good and the bad. Go through these prior relationships. And I suggest writing it down. Every chapter being, a different relationship in your life, starting with your primary relationships with your parents or your caregivers, and look for patterns. The way people treated you, the way you reacted, the way you felt. And then examine projections, which means look at relationships and things that have happened in relationships and ask yourself, was I reacting to what was going on at that moment in time in that context? Or was I taking all of my stuff from the past and holding that person hostage for what other people have done? Was I reacting to something from my past? And through all that, you will be able to find good and bad lessons. You can find lessons of strength and hope and growth. And you'll probably also find lessons of, in the future, I'm going to do that differently. Own and normalize your feelings. Based on what you went through, whatever traumas, adverse childhood experiences, traumatic events in your life that you've gone through that contribute to the insecurity in your relationships, those are real. And it's important to own them. And when you start feeling anxious, angry, triggered, envious, jealous, to own those feelings and go, okay, I understand how this might be protective. I understand how this might be a survival strategy for me. Now, what am I going to do with it? My body's telling me there's a fire alarm going off saying there might be a threat. I recognize that I'm feeling anxious. And acknowledging your feelings non-judgmentally is so important, because if you get caught up judging yourself, you can't figure out what's causing it. You're too busy trying to convict yourself of something. So notice your feelings, own them, accept them, and just say, okay, based on my life experiences and what's going on, that feeling is valid. It makes sense. However, I need to examine whether it's accurate in this present context. So identify triggers and mitigation strategies for unsafeness and disempowerment. What things make you feel anxious? What things contribute? And generally, you kind of want to limit this. You don't want to have a list of 50 things, but try to stick to, 10, 15 triggers. You can't possibly identify all of them, but you'll get a really good idea of what some of them are by identifying maybe 10 to 15. And then you can figure out strategies for how to handle them. So when you're triggered, what can you do in order to help downregulate yourself so that you can get into your wise mind and make an informed decision about how to improve in the next moment? Well, this is the reason that meditation is really great for this, because it helps you to quiet the busy thoughts in the mind. But there's many ways to just go about this. So there's what people call FCP. So look at the facts. What are the facts for and against? Because there's probably some elements of what you're anxious about. There are some facts supporting it for sure, but there also might be facts against it, and you want to examine them both. The C would stand for what aspects about this situation can you control? Maybe it's just your reaction you control, but maybe there are other things that you can control, such as in the situation when you feel triggered. One of the things that you might be able to do is communicate with the other person. And P stands for probabilities. So based on the facts, in this situation, in this context, if you do the things that you can that are within your control, what is the probability that it will result in abandonment? So then there's what some people refer to as a beta test. Beta testing is a strategy for helping you just to down-regulate and just take some positive steps. So B stands for breathe. Take a couple of slow, deep breaths. Not like at the doctor's office, like really slow, like as slow as you can for a count of 8 at least. You don't want to hear this air rushing. It wants to be slow and controlled. Hold it for a few seconds and slowly exhale that. Do that just 2 or 3 times, and that will help dampen down your adrenaline response. E stands for examine the facts for and against. T stands for try something. You want to figure out what are your options. You've examined your facts for and against. Now you're going to try an option to improve the next moment. And then A stands for assess. So once you've tried something, then you want to step back and assess and go, how well did that work out? Was it effective? Was it ineffective? Another thing you can do is just seek support. Have people, if you have people that you can count on, that you can call when you feel triggered, that you can call when you feel anxious, angry, symptomatic, we'll say. Utilize your support system if it's there. There's another thing called urge serve. So some urges will come in, peak, and depending on who you listen to, come in for 10 to 30 minutes if you don't feed these urges. I heard this analogy the other day of urges kind of like being tidal waves after an earthquake. So the initial triggering event is the initial earthquake. It was the big one. And that created this big wave that's going to come in. Now, that wave can go down, but if there are aftershocks, then that'll continue feeding that wave. And so perseverating on a situation can be like aftershocks. Sitting there thinking about it, dwelling, wondering, is giving that wave more energy, more power, making it build into the tsunami. So what you want to do is acknowledge your feelings, acknowledge this tidal wave, and then redirect your attention for a few moments until you can just get into your centered, still mind. You're not ignoring your feelings. You're just saying, I want to chill out until I can think more clearly. So I'm acting from a wiser mind, a calmer mind, instead of my autopilot, emotional, make it stop, impulsive mind. So learn what a healthy relationship and secure attachment looks like. And that can involve many things: interviewing other people, reading self-help books, talking to a therapist, whatever. But you want to examine, what do healthy boundaries look like? How do you set and maintain them? Healthy boundaries aren't on roller skates all the time, where one day it's okay to do this, the next day it's not. Healthy boundaries are consistent, but kind of like in a house, you've got doors, you've got windows, you can let people in when you choose to, but you can also keep that door locked when you choose to. So you want to explore what intimacy looks like. What is healthy intimacy? What does it look like? Both emotional and physical, sexual intimacy. What does that look like? And a lot of people, when they start examining that, start to feel high levels of anxiety, because when they've been in intimate relationships before, when the core feature of intimacy is vulnerability, and when they've been vulnerable before and it's turned out badly. So intimacy often creates a lot of anxiety that needs to be processed. So learn about the craves, creating those secure relationships that are consistent, and how can you be consistent with yourself? regularly, mindful of what you need, what you want. How can you be responsive once you know what you need and want? How can you consistently be responsive to that? How can you give yourself positive attention, not just reactive when something goes wrong, but actually be your own best friend? I know it sounds corny, but it's really, really important. How can you validate your own feelings, wants, and needs as real? And in practicing that, it's so important because they are real. So, as I said earlier, when you feel anxious, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a threat in the current environment at the current time. But your feeling of anxiety was very real. And that's your body's way of saying, hey, bud, get off this couch. Make sure there's not a problem. E stands for encouragement, and that's cheerleading, encouraging people to do things. So encouraging yourself to step outside of your comfort zone. And S is for support. And that's different than encouragement, because support comes after you've encouraged somebody to step out of that comfort zone. Support is being there with them or at their back, helping them along the way, encouraging them and being supportive. And then look at communication. Exploring assertive communication and communication pitfalls like mind reading and assuming that create a lot of misunderstandings and distrust in any type of relationship. And then develop your own self-esteem. People have a strong self-esteem, and let's use the analogy of cookies. I love cookies. What we want in relationships is for people to feel like they are very good all by themselves. Thank you very much. So sugar cookies, very good all by themselves. Thank you very much. Chocolate chip cookies, very good all by themselves. Thank you very much. But two people with healthy self-esteems can stand alone and feel okay about themselves. They don't need milk. They don't need others to validate them. They're like, you know what? I'm a sugar cookie and I'm a chocolate chip. And when you put them together, you could get, well, I guess, essentially it's just more chocolate chip cookies. But they bring out the best in each other, right? The sugar cookie complements the chocolate complements the sugar. So when we develop self-esteem in people, we're helping them feel like they don't need to find anyone else to complete them. They're more able to just search for relationships that enhance themselves. We want to help people to develop these secure attachment relationships with themselves. And you do that through mindfulness and through authenticity. Being mindful, consistently mindful and aware of what you need and living authentically, using tools such as meditation to accomplish those goals. And some people will engage in decisional balance activities regarding their future relationships. So when they get into a relationship, this balance exercise is really simple. You want to look at staying out of a relationship, just not even going there. You want to look at the pros and the cons, of staying out of that relationship, and then the pros and cons of getting into this relationship. So you need to actually look at the pros and cons of no change versus change. And so what do we do as far as, treatment? Well, starting with that pattern of intense and stable relationships, we'll just kind of go through. You need to explore the history of those relationships and the lessons that were learned. This is huge in order to start understanding where the intensity comes from and what creates this instability in those relationships. And really kind of creating a narrative describing what a healthy relationship, a healthy, stable relationship will look like to you, to that person. And you need to identify, what do you need to do differently? If I want to create this type of healthy relationship, what do I need to do differently? And maybe what do I need to look for in a significant other? And then we have the fear of emotional intimacy. So, in order to address that, it's really going to mean becoming vulnerable. So, But that goes back to learning about boundaries and helping people gradually develop emotional intimacy and taking a chance. In counseling, they can call that reciprocal self-disclosure. You give a little, the other person gives a little back. You give a little more, the other person gives a little more. And by doing that, people don't put all their cards on the table and become excessively vulnerable at once. But also create a rescue plan, in the event that the relationship ends or something goes wrong and the person feels hurt. Developing a rescue plan for yourself for when my feelings are hurt. What makes me feel good? How can I quickly come out of this? When I feel injured emotionally, what can I do in order to increase my own sense of safety? Might mean talking to a friend, bouncing it off somebody else, getting support from someone else. It might just mean looking within, working through it right in that moment or, soon after. And really just getting clear on the whys and not allowing yourself to wallow. Those things can be part of your plan depending on, what your individual triggers are and what your personality is. Needing constant reassurance. And this is one of those things that might be partly in habit. So when someone starts feeling like they need reassurance, it's important for them to ask themselves, why do I need reassurance from someone else? What am I afraid of? What am I feeling anxious about? What are the facts for and against that in this context? How have I handled similar situations before? So moving from a place of needing reassurance from others to a place of self-reassurance or awareness, even if this goes wrong, I'll be right, or even if this goes wrong, I've got supports that can help me get through it, or I'll figure it out, So hypervigilance, becoming aware of becoming hypervigilant to different things. There's certain expressions, and little tics and stuff that I know I pick up on that remind me of things that people did in my own childhood. And that sometimes I'll see that and I'll be like, ooh, and I catch this little twinge. And it's not even necessarily such a negative twinge, but it just really brings me back into that moment. So it's really important to kind of become more aware of those so that you can just begin to gradually desensitize yourself against those little triggers, When I catch myself doing it, I kind of will go over those, like FCP, the facts. Did I do something to trigger this person or tick them off, or are they just quirky or whatever, You just kind of have to question yourself, right? Just kind of look at it from sort of an outsider's perspective. But it's important to really recognize and take away the power from some of those things. Being hypersensitive to criticism. As people develop their self-esteem, their ability to tolerate criticism will improve. But also separating criticism of a behavior from criticism of the person. Just because somebody is providing you, and we will hope that it's with constructive feedback about something, doesn't mean that they think that you're a failure or that you're bad. What they're saying is what you did might be done better in a different way, Then we go into overanalysis paralysis. And this is one that takes a while to get over. But when you've noticed that you are stuck in this circle of analyzing something and you just can't seem to jump off the ride, then it's really important that you write down your options. Seek feedback from other healthy people that might be able to actually impart wisdom in that situation, Don't just keep going over the shoulda, coulda, woulda. You have to go back into the looking at it from an identifying place. Look at a way to react differently in the future. Instead of continuing to analyze, identify what you know and how you're going to handle that in the future. And intrusive thoughts of abandonment or rejection. Sometimes it's really easy to fall back into these old thoughts, but it's really important to just process these feelings as you become aware of them in order to identify where they're coming from. Because if they keep coming back, that's your brain saying, beware, which might also indicate that you haven't fully processed and dealt with the issues that are causing those triggers from your past. Maybe you didn't even know how far back they go. Relationship sabotage. Hopefully you can learn the ways that you typically sabotage your relationships by looking at prior relationships. And you can identify some key warning signs when you are feeling anxious, when you're getting ready to get to that point where you usually start sabotaging yourself, and recognizing key behaviors within yourself that you usually do, like starting to become hypercritical, picking fights for no reason, whatever it is. When you start doing that, that's a cue to you to, whoa, let's step back. Let's examine. Am I reacting to what's going on in this present situation at this point in time? And am I responding accurately? Or am I responding in order to protect myself from fear of vulnerability from the past? Clinging to unhealthy relationships. Go back to that decisional balance exercise. Make a pro and con list. What are the pros of staying in this relationship? And the drawbacks to staying in this current relationship? What are the pros of being single again and free of this relationship? And what are the drawbacks of being single again from this relationship? Because those drawbacks to being single again can sometimes be terrifying depending on what attachment style you have. So it's important to address those or you're not going to be motivated to take that step. People pleasing. Now, it's always good to be a nice person and to occasionally do things that are nice for other people. Please do so. But people pleasing to your own detriment becomes a problem. It's all a matter of moderation. So examine what you're doing. If you have difficulties saying no, if you feel like you need to go overboard and above and beyond for others, if you don't, they're going to reject you, then that's really important to examine some of that self-talk, that inner self-talk, and look for the facts and examine the relationships. And if you determine that, yeah, if I don't do what Jim Bob wants whenever he wants it, then he abandons me, is that a healthy relationship? Difficulty trusting others. Trust comes with time, but a lot of people who've been in insecure relationships in the past have difficulty trusting themselves. So of course, it's important to start learning how to listen to yourself, to your head, to your heart, to your gut. What are they telling you? Are all three telling you it's a good thing? Or is one trying to speak up and say, hey, something's up here? Which one? Why? Learning to trust yourself and learning how to trust others. Examining your relationships when people do things. Just notice when they do things that are trustworthy, instead of just only focusing exclusively on when people make mistakes. Because even in the best relationships, people will make mistakes. And you want to examine, is this an isolated incident where, she broke a promise? Or is this something that's habitual for them? Self-blame when things don't work out. Well, a lot of times in relationships, it takes two to tango. So there's things that you might have been able to do differently, and those can be learning experiences for you. But it's also important to step back and to examine what part the other person did play in this. A lot of times codependency is a big issue in addiction recovery, and the person with the addiction might relapse. And the significant other might blame themselves, for example, for that relapse. And it's important to look at, okay, well, what part did that person play in the person's choice to go back out and use again? Low self-esteem or a sense of unworthiness. There are tons of books out there on improving your self-esteem. It's just going to be a matter of finding one for you, or whatever YouTube channel, for example. But a person with a strong sense of self-esteem can look in the mirror and say, you know what? I like you. You're a good person. You make mistakes, but so do we all. But you are a good person. And that's what we're going for. Emotional dysregulation or numbing. Addressing this is often multi-pronged because lots of people who are in codependent relationships or form insecure attachments, also because of the HPA-Axis being dysregulated, they're not getting good quality sleeping. Their circadian rhythm is out of whack. So sometimes they're not even eating healthfully. So it's really important to address the HPA-Axis from both a psychological standpoint, addressing your thoughts, your feelings, as well as a physiological standpoint, doing what you can to help your body rest and recover, and reducing the stress, reducing the activation of your threat response system. Anxiety, depression, jealousy, envy. These are all emotions that we feel, that we need to identify what triggers them, and then process those things. Obviously, I wanted to keep this under an hour, but there's tons of stuff all over YouTube and all over the internet everywhere that can deal with depression, anxiety, jealousy, envy. Find something that works for you. Being highly critical over yourself or others. I have heard a mnemonic for this, but what does it think? Is what you're getting ready to say truthful? Sometimes people are doing things and they're not doing them the way that you want them to. All right, so maybe there's some truth to what you have to say. Is it helpful? Well, maybe you think that what you have to say is helpful because if they do it your way, you think it's going to be better. Is it inspirational? If you say it, are you saying it in a way that inspires them to grow? Or is it they're reacting to make you stop criticizing? Is it necessary? And that's really important because sometimes people are doing things differently. And you might wish that they're doing things your way, but the way they're doing it is still getting the job done, at least minimally. So is what you're saying necessary to be critical? And if it is, can you say it in the kindest way possible? So truthful, helpful, inspirational, necessary, and kind. And that's true in your own self-talk as well as engaging with others. When you're being critical, a lot of times that is a power move. Criticism often serves as a way to subordinate people. So for what reason are you wanting to do this? Is it truly to be helpful and inspirational, or have you been triggered and are you wanting to take them down a peg? Early attachments create a prototype for future relationships. Later experiences of rejection and abandonment can also inhibit secure adult attachment. Insecure attachments lead to a pervasive sense of unsafeness and disempowerment, which can often cause disempowerment or stress in the HPA-Axis or threat response system, which will lead you to a whole variety of symptoms from physical to emotional and even interpersonal. When early attachments are insecure, the person will often need to re-examine their expectations of people because their current expectations were based on an unhealthy model, and develop a new relationship model. Now, the suggestions that I gave for dealing with some of the symptoms of codependency are obviously not the complete catalog of all the ways to deal with this, but I'm hoping it gives you some ideas of some techniques that you might be able to use to start addressing codependency and insecure attachment or avoidant attachment in adult relationships. Please do check back the channel for more videos like this. And I love you guys so much. Thank you for watching. Take good care of yourselves.